Welcome, everybody. Today, I have a guest that I have spoken to before, but it's been like 8 or 9 years or
Yeah,
something
it's
like
been a
that.
while.
It's been a long, long time. So, I'm here with Richard Thomas, and we're going to be talking about his new book, Incarnate. Can you give yourself a brief introduction, Richard?
Sure. So I'm Richard Thomas. I've been writing about 15 years. I'm a writer of speculative fiction, so somewhere under the fantasy, sci-fi, horror umbrella. I have 4 novels, 4 collections, over 180 stories in print. Um, I've edited 5 anthologies. I edited a magazine and a press, and I've been nominated for a Bram Stoker Award twice, a Shirley Jackson Award once, and a Thriller Award. And I currently spend my time writing, editing, teaching, and publishing. So, yeah.
Awesome. Now, Richard Thomas is an interesting name because I went to research you just to find like your website and whatnot. And
Yeah.
first thing I see is the actor from like the It movie or I
Well,
forget his this. Yeah.
yeah, that's what I get all the time. Yeah. You wouldn't believe how many women slide into my profile
Really?
talking up John Boy. And I'm like, slow your roll. I'm not him. But yeah,
Like,
there's a certain fan of a certain age who definitely sees Richard Thomas and thinks John Boy Walton. I have had to battle him on Google for a long time to try and get my name to appear above his in any searches. It's taken a long time. And then the funny thing, like you said, he was also in It. So that was, I think, back in the 80s when I was in high school, maybe.
yeah, like late
And
80s, early
yeah,
90s.
and then he played the character who was also the writer. So it was this really weird meta kind of moment. And every night it would have the list of the characters, and they would say, and Richard Thomas. I think because it was just alphabetically last. And so I was always like, yeah. But that was back when I was just a fan of Stephen King and, hadn't even really started writing anything. So, yeah.
Are you still a fan of Stephen King?
I am. I mean, I've probably read more of his stuff than any other writer. I've probably read, just about everything he's written. The last couple of years, I haven't been a big fan of like the Holly trilogy or whatever. I liked some of it. I liked it okay. I guess to me, the last really great book he wrote was probably 11/22/63.
Yeah.
That was probably my last big favorite of his. I like reading him. His collections and shorter stuff has been really good, but it's hard. I couldn't imagine. I barely have 4 books out. I can't imagine trying to come up with ideas for 40 or 50 or 60. And so I think about how many of his books have really been a huge influence on me. And my favorites, everything from The Stand and It to The Long Walk, Dead Zone. All the like the weird novella collections, short stories. Like he's just been a really big influence on my writing. Although I don't tend to really write a lot like him. He's more of a storyteller. I'm more of a story shower, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
It's funny though, because the one story in my last short story collection, Spontaneous Human Combustion, called Notice Tollens, was definitely the most telling I've ever had in a story. And it was a little long, like 6,600 words, more convoluted, more plot heavy. I'm usually more character driven or atmosphere driven. And that's the one that has had more people attached to it in Hollywood, screenwriters and people pitching it and trying to turn it into something. And I guess that kind of voice comes through. So I'm going to have to write more like him.
Yeah. There's another Richard Thomas. I think it was either Richard J. Thomas or Richard P. Thomas, and he actually lives near me. He's also a writer.
Oh, wow.
But he doesn't write fiction. He writes like history books about his area. He's about 3 hours away from me. I think it's like Owen Sound or something.
Yeah.
I was like looking at him. I'm like, that's not Richard Thomas.
No. I am
not the Richard Thomas I know. Anyway.
Yeah. I am Richard G. Thomas, Richard Gordon Thomas the third. My dad was a junior. My son's the fourth. Nice. There was also an animator for like Bugs Bunny cartoons. I think it was a Richard H. Thomas. And so I would get excited as a kid because it was like so close.
Yeah.
one letter away. But he did like background design or something, whatever, for the cartoons. But yeah, that's it.
Excuse me. Yeah. And we first talked, as I mentioned, right at the beginning here, we talked on the Darkness Dwells podcast when I was doing that show, which feels like forever ago now. And it was way back. It was way back when this was released.
Oh, yeah. Got a beautiful horror story. It's awesome.
This got me an interview with you. It got me an interview with Mercedes Yardley. Nice. And I believe it also got me an interview with Let me see if he's in here before I embarrass myself. I'm not sure. I must be thinking of something else. Oh, no. He's here. So it got me an interview with Ramsey Campbell too.
Nice.
Yeah,
nice.
that was an awesome time. But it was also funny in that a couple months after I talked to you, I talked to Laird Barron for something else, and he said while we were talking, he's like, I listened to your show. It's like I listened to that episode you did with with Richard Thomas.
Oh, really? Wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
and
I love Laird. Yeah, I think my story in there was Repent, which actually ended up being in my last short story collection. And Laird is just a gift. He's a saint. I love Laird. Amazing writer. I love his work. He also was kind enough to write the foreword, the introduction to the anthology I edited, The New Black, which was my first anthology I edited. It was all reprints, kind of just some of my favorite neo-noir stories. It's so funny because when I was putting that together, and then I was looking for somebody to write the intro, I was like, who did I leave out? Like, who did I forget? I tried to get stories from like Dennis Lehane. I was like all over the place trying to get stories. I had to talk to a big, like Ben Percy's story. I wanted the title story, refresh from his collection, and like his publisher, I forget who it was, Penguin Random House. They like wanted like $1,200. I'm like, I can't pay that. And he's like, I have his other story, Dial Tone, if you want. No, it actually turned out to be a better story, but I ran across Laird and I'm like, oh, I should have asked Laird for a story. But then he wrote the intro and it was just amazing. So I just really feel blessed. I got lucky that ended up getting him to do that because he really understood kind of the intersection between crime and horror and where neo-noir sat. And that was kind of early in my career. And that just really was just a super cool guy. I love his work.
Yeah, me too. I'm a huge fan. But that was an interesting story with the Gutted anthology because what's the guy who runs Crystal Lake Publishing? It's
Meinhardt. Yeah,
Meinhardt. I was talking with him through emails, and he was like, okay, we got this book coming out, which was Gutted, and he was like, I'd like you to help me promote it. And he's like, name like 3 or 4 people you'd love to interview for your podcast, but don't go crazy. And I knew when he said don't go crazy, that means don't ask about Ramsey Campbell.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I put his name, I put your name, Mercedes Yardley, and Ramsey Campbell. I was like, you know what, I'm going to shoot for it. Why not, right?
Yeah.
And he was able to set it all up for me, and that's awesome. That was a great time, man.
Very cool.
Yeah. Now, speaking of you being like an editor and whatnot, you recently you ran Gamut magazine, and for how long did that go for?
Well, we had 2 iterations. I think the first one, I don't even 5 or 6 years ago, I did a Kickstarter. We raised like $52,000. It was a whole crazy thing. I didn't think it was going to happen. Then it happened.
I remember when that happened. Yeah,
it was a really great year, and we were paying 10 cents a word, which back then not a lot of people were paying. I made a lot of mistakes, but mostly just I think I didn't realize how long it takes to build a brand, and how long it takes to kind of build up a body of work. And I think if I had, maybe if I paid people 5 cents instead of 10, or maybe paid a little less than 10, something. Maybe if I'd budgeted for 3 years instead of 1. Because we had like 600 people subscribe at like $30 a head. And then in order to like stay in business and to cover our cost, we had to like double that. And we got to about 900 and just couldn't quite make it happen. And so, you would think I was in advertising for 15 to 20 years before I became a writer. And you'd think I would understand how long it takes to build up a brand and get your image out there. And at the time, raising $50,000 just seemed like a lot of money. And so the whole thing seemed crazy to me. And so the idea of raising like 150 or raising 100 or making it work on 50, like just whatever, I just couldn't fathom it. And so we had one glorious year and then we shut down. We resurrected it this past year with the help of my partner, Richard Wood. And it was a great year of quality writing. I think the stories are amazing. I'm really proud of the body of work we did. We got to publish a lot of really great news stories. I just sent out all the stories I had. John Joseph Adams sent me an email asking about stuff for best American science fiction and fantasy. And I sent Ellen Datlow everything for best horror. And I sent everything in for awards and whatnot. And it's just kind of a weird combination of things. I think we tried to do too much too fast. I think going magazine and classes and publishing arm, I think we're running when we should have been trying to walk. When Lit Reactor went under, I thought there'd be a real gap in the market for like classes and stuff. And so I thought, oh, we'll fill that void. Because I've been teaching over there and writing a column for like 10 years. And I thought it'd be easy peasy, throw up some classes, a couple $100, no problem. And then just like nobody signed up. And
Wow.
I don't, and subscriptions were like very low. And so I think it's a combination of, there's just a lot of really great free writing out there. And so whether you're going to someplace like Tor, who has a great backer in Macmillan, who can kind of throw money at it, they have deep pockets. I mean, it could be a loss leader for them. They can just use that to like set up their publishing arm or whatever. But when you can get the stuff, when there's stuff online, The Dark, Nightmare, Clark's World, everybody, I think it's just so much great quality content out there that people aren't going to pay big bucks for a subscription, which I still thought was pretty cheap. Like, I mean, anything under $52 a year to me seems, it's $1 a week. It just seems pretty. $4 a month doesn't seem like a lot to me, but for whatever reason, people balked at it, and so he had to shut down. Richard ended up taking the books he was going to do and is rolling them into his press, Ruodon, and so he's going to keep doing the publishing arm. The teaching didn't work, but I'm still, through all this stuff, I've still been writing, teaching my classes, editing, and publishing for Gamut. So it was a really great second year. It was really fun. I got to also reprint a lot of really great stories by authors that I love as well. And so between like new content from people I know and new content from people that were totally new to me, I know there are definitely some people that was their first prose sale because they told me so, and they were very happy and excited about it. It was just really a great experience. I discovered so many voices. I was really happy. We got a really nice, one of the cool things about the original Gamut, and even when I ran Dark House Press too, was that we really got stories from all over the world. And so I just kept reading more broadly. We had a great reprint out of Faya, which, is Black speculative fiction. And we just, really a number of like LGBTQ plus people all over the world, just really, really excited. A lot of voices that I either knew or didn't know or have come to know. And just, I thought it was a really great mix of stories. So, you try, it works or it doesn't for whatever reasons. I don't think coming through COVID and everything, and everything's just kind of weird right now. And I think in some ways people are kind of hunkered down a little bit, but we did our best.
Yeah, and that's all you can do. It sounds like the experience was quite stressful just because of money.
It was never stressful to me for money because I was never the money guy. My partner was, but I think it was just frustrating in that I didn't understand why certain things were happening, right? So like we even did all these surveys with people and stuff, and they said they want A, B, and C, and then we do A, B, and C, and then nobody showed up. So just, I didn't know what happened. Maybe people were sick of looking at my face. Maybe they want to read other stuff. Maybe the price point was too high. Maybe I don't know. Because I thought with, like I said, with Lit Reactor going away, I thought we could fill that gap and fill the classes. And publishing is always a tricky thing. So I don't know if we were publishing the wrong things the wrong way or what. But I think it was a lot of different convergences at one time just kind of led to it not being successful. And so all you can do is try and put it out there, and the public will tell you whether they want it or not.
Yeah. Now it went away before and then came back. Do you think it'll ever come back again, or?
My first reaction is God, no. But I mean, if the right situation, I guess. I don't know. I try to never say never. I think with the right backing, the right setup, with the right people involved, who knows? I mean, I've worked with a number of different publishers with my writing as an editor. I had lunch with Ellen Datlow at StokerCon 2 years ago, and I was like, maybe she's going to ask me to come be an editor at Tor. And like, no, she just wanted to talk and hang out. Yeah. And I was honored, and I had a great lunch with her. But I have all these big ideas. John Joseph Adams, I got a story into Lightspeed magazine this year, and I've been trying to get in there for like 15 years. And so I was very excited about that. And then talking to John, I'm getting to know him a little bit. Like, that was just super cool for me. And then when he dropped me an email asking for the Gamut stuff, I was like, oh, that's cool. And then I was like, setting off my stuff as well, because I had the story in Lightspeed. I want to make sure it gets back in front of the whoever's reading for that as well. And so I'm like, well, maybe something will happen with John. Maybe
Hmm.
maybe John will take a look at all the great stuff I published at Gamut and say, I'm getting old. I want to retire. Why don't you take over the Best Americans? I don't know. I have these crazy delusions. That's what I thought Ellen might do too. I'm thinking about retiring. Richard, you want to take over? You've edited some stuff.
I don't know. I think honestly, that's just a part of being a creative person and where you'd like to see yourself, right? Because I have similar things. I'm like, I'm gonna go do this, and this is gonna be awesome, and all these people are gonna notice, and they're gonna love me, and they're gonna want me to go do this, and that, and then it never happens, and you're like, well, yeah, okay, but I think it's just part of being a creative person. It's
important to stay open to it, and you never know. I mean, enough crazy things have happened. I think about just my relationship with like Cemetery Dance, for example. What a crazy roller coaster ride that has been, from being just a fan of their work to my first prose sale was with Cemetery Dance, ended up being in an anthology called Shivers 6 alongside Stephen King and Peter Straub. Nice. And that was a big deal to me. I think I cried when I got in. And then I got into Cemetery Dance magazine twice.
That's nice too.
And then they ended up publishing my third short story collection. They did the ebook, and then Crystal Lake did the print version. And so like I'm batting 1,000. It was this whole crazy thing. And every time it's happened, I've had to look at the email to be like, I think I read the word not, because you get the form letter, and when you get the acceptance, sometimes it's just like, it's not that much different. They just take out the word not, and then you get some nice words at the end, about why they took it, why they liked it, whatever. Even the one was like for Lightspeed, I was like, I had to read it 3 times to make sure it was true. So, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think it's your work. There's so many amazing writers out there. Every year when I look at everybody who's nominated for awards on the recommended reading list, all my friends, all my students, there's just so much great stuff out there. It keeps me young. It keeps me reading, keeps me inspired to write new stuff. And I tell my students and my clients, just take the shot. You never know. I go through my process. I always send it to the dark. They reject me in 2 days, and I move on. If Nightmares open, I send over there. They reject me in 4 days. And it's just like, I used to not even take the shot. I think I don't even think I even set my stuff to tour for a long time because I just didn't think my stuff was good enough. And they take a really long time. But outside of that, I was like trying to pre-qualify. And I'm like, oh, this story's okay. And this one's okay. And I'm like, I want to send them something really good. And then they'd also take like 9 months. And so I think sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot. But most of the markets these days don't take as long anymore. They tend to be pretty respectful about it. And, 3 months, maybe 6 months max, I mean, Cemetery Dance is so weird and so infrequent. I remember when they opened up, I had a story sitting at Tor. And I was like, oh, man, do I simultaneously submit? It was like the last time Tor is going to be open, and I was like, oh, I have to. And then the deadline was coming. I'm like, I'm going to send it to them, and then Tor rejected me. I'd already been out shopping it for like 9 active months. Then I sent it to Cemetery Dance, and then it was like another 6 months before I heard a yes. So it's just a year and a half on a story. It's crazy, but if you never take the shot, and I think if you don't read the publications, if you don't get a sense, I think one of the things I keep forgetting, I tell my students, is if you look at the cover of Cemetery Dance, it says a magazine of horror and suspense. And people forget the suspense part. The 2 stories I got in are both kind of paranoid thrillers. And the second one definitely has a more horrifying ending, but they're kind of old school Cemetery Dance. So I think, I don't know. I think it's always a crapshoot, but I think if we read the work by people, and I try to read a couple of different best of the years every year, from one of my classes I teach, it really helps me to get a better sense of what's happening, what are people buying, what's working, are there any trends, like who's getting in and why. And that's part of what I teach in my workshop, is my advanced creative writing workshop. We read best horror of the year, best American science fiction and fantasy, and best American for literary. And then we workshop 2 stories. So we read 2 stories from the best and 2 stories from students, and we compare them, and we go, where are they and where am I, and how do I close that gap, and what are they doing right? How can I apply that to my work? And then when you look at stories and they don't work, ask yourself why, and what do you not want to do in your writing? And when you read stuff that you really like, that you give like an 8 or 8.5 or a 9 out of 10, why? What do you like about it, and can you incorporate it into your work? And then go read more of their work. You mentioned Laird. I've read a ton of Laird stuff. His story Tiptoe was one we taught in class recently. Love that story. Super creepy. Stephen Graham Jones, Brian Evanson. There's so many people I've read over the years that have just really blown my mind, and really, Jeff Vandermeer changed me as a writer. And I think that's why we read, and that's why I read and write and edit and teach. Is all that together, I think, helps me become a better writer.
I know that you speak of being a teacher,
Mhm.
and I know that you used to run online courses. Is that
Mhm.
something you still do? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. I still have my website, Storyville, and I teach my short story mechanics class on there. I do an at your own pace version you can download now because Lit Reactor used to do. I did it for 10 years at Lit Reactor. I teach it like 3 times a year, 20 students, and it would always sell out. Did that for 10 years, and then when they went under, I didn't have a place to host it. So now I'm in the process of finding a new place to do that. But the mechanics class was one I came out of my MFA program, and I was like, well, I feel like I could teach a basic class now. And so I'd been writing a column for Lit Reactor, and I said, hey, I'd like to teach a basic class. Are you guys up for it? And they're like, sure. And next thing you know, 10 years later,
Mhm.
it's a success and been working really well. Studying freight tags triangle, freight tags pyramid, really kind of basic stuff, but old school, back to Plato and Socrates, dramatic structure. But to me, if you aren't doing these things, a lot of times that's where you screw up. So, inciting incident, narrative hook, exposition, your world building, rising tension, internal, external conflict, building to a conclusion, a resolution, change, something has to change, and then the denouement or denouement, the epiphany, the understanding of what has happened. That's often at the end of a story. If you're crying or you're moved, it's often that denouement. And I started doing that class. I taught that for a while. And then people were like, do you have a more advanced class? And I was like, I should develop one. And so I put together my contemporary dark fiction class. And it was a really nice intersection of, was teaching 4 books that I loved. Josh Mallerman's Bird Box, Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, Sarah Grand's Come Closer, and then China Mieville's Perdido Street Station.
Mhm.
And then I taught each week would be a column and an essay and an exercise. And the columns I wrote, and then the essay, the stories came out of the anthologies I'd edited. So I pulled them from the New Black and Exigencies and the lineup and all the anthologies I'd edited because I knew those stories really well. I'd edited them, I published them. They meant something to me. They were personal stories to me. And so I grabbed one of those stories and it would talk about character, or talk about setting, or talk about, conflict or whatever. And that class is 16 weeks, a more expensive class. And then I did that for a couple of years. And then people were like, you should do a workshop. And I was like, I should do a workshop. So I was like, and I wanted to do like a more advanced workshop. So like my short story mechanics is like kind of your basic rudimentary first time student or like high school level class. Dark fiction, I'll say, is like a collegiate level class. It's 16 weeks. It's the length of a semester. And then the workshop is really critical analysis. And that's kind of like a mini MFA program where we assume you understand a lot of things and we're trying to get better, get up into that rarefied air where we can publish with these elite markets. And so I teach that one a lot now. And then I do like a novel in a year class, which is a big class. It's a huge commitment, a lot of time and money and effort. And it goes all year long. And we have daily prompts. And then we meet the third Thursday of every month and we write a book. First month is all pre-writing, 6 months of writing, 11,000 words a month, rough drafts. Then we do 4 months of editing, and then a month in December of all like submission prompts. So the goal in the year is to rough draft a book and then fine tune it, turn it in a final. So I read it twice, get it over that like 65,000 word mark, and then send it out and shop it and publish it. And so that's kind of the core group of the classes I teach. And that's been a really good kind of mini program that I've developed over the years. So if people want to come in and instead of spending, $30,000 to get an MFA, they can go through the mechanics, the dark fiction to the workshop to the novel. And you're doing the whole thing for like $7,000 or something. If you don't do the novel in your class, it's even less. And so that's been a lot of my stuff I'm doing. I also do some stuff for Writer's Digest, online Writer's Digest at university. And then I've been working for a group called the Gilliam Writers Group, where I've been a writing coach. So that's been a whole new thing I've been doing. Just been really interesting, trying a whole different market of people who are looking for someone to help coach them through different projects. So
that is incredibly awesome. That's a lot.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, I'm doing this full time now. So, I wasn't, like I said, I was in advertising for like 17, 18 years. And of those 18 years, I probably was writing for 5. And I basically over time was trying to kind of, reduce my advertising and raise my writing. And so my living now is a combination of what I earn as a writer, an editor. I edit manuscripts and novels just in addition to my classwork, teaching, and then any publishing I do. So all that together is, how I survive. And it's kind of terrifying because you're out here hustling, but I control my life to a certain degree. And then, I'm always looking for cool opportunities. And then I try to publish, 4 to 6 new short stories a year. And then Incarnate coming out this year. I haven't had a book out in, I think, 3 or 5 years. So I'm trying to be a little faster about it. But, really, I should be working on the next one right now. And I'm not. I should.
I think that's every writer's
Yeah.
curse. Like, there's that saying, I should be writing.
Mhm.
And a lot of writers feel that way. Excuse me. Now, just to clarify, people, if they're interested, they can go to your website and find that information for classes and whatnot.
Yep, I'm on social media everywhere. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky and Threads and everywhere. But yeah, it's just storyvilleonline.com is my website, and that's where all my classes are hosted. That's also my editing stuff. It has has testimonials, all my students, and it has like a section for our students' work and where they've gone and what they've done. And yeah,
awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on just a little bit. You've written a lot of short stories. I mean, you have 4 collections, and that's like so many more stories than just say novels, right? Like, so when I see that, I assume automatically that you have a love for the shorter form of storytelling. And so I'm wondering, I asked this because I have a lot of authors on here who do that, and I'm fascinated by that because I love short stories myself. So I want to know from you, what is it about short story that draws you?
Yeah, it's a lot of things. Writing a book is hard. And what I tell my students is don't write a book until you're ready. And when I usually tell them ready is when you've kind of honed your craft for a couple of years. And usually the way you do that is with short fiction. And so I tell students, that's kind of what I did. That's what I did coming up. I spent a number of years writing short stories before I wrote my first book. Because I think we need to understand a couple of things. We need to understand our voice. Who are we? What are we saying? Where do we come from? What are our influences? Who are the authors that influence us? What kind of stories are we trying to tell? When I came up, I was writing a lot more kind of neo-noir, transgressive realism. And that's what my second and third book, Disintegration and Breaker, were. A lot of my short stories were like that. The thing with like thrillers and crimes, that can easily lean into horror. Realism can lean into horror. It doesn't have to be supernatural. I did that for a long time. And then one day I realized that there weren't a lot of markets for mystery, crime, thriller short stories. There's like Ellery Queen and Hitchcock, and like that's it. It's like there aren't a whole lot of places. But if you just push a little bit into the dark, if you push into horror, if you push into fantasy and science fiction, then it opens up this whole other realm of possibilities. So I write fantasy, science fiction, and horror, and then every other kind of subset under them, I write magical realism and new weird coming out of the old weird, transgressive, Southern Gothic, you name it, and literary fiction too. Writing short stories, you get to experiment. You can try out new things once you figure out what your voice is. I was doing a lot of kind of leaning into the new weird. I think, post Perdido Street Station, post Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, I had this new love of the uncanny and the weird. And I just started pushing in that direction a little bit more. And so I just you can experiment with things, first person, third person, one point of view, multiple points of view, past, present tense, second person. You can try out, write a vampire story. You can write a zombie story. You can write psychological horror. You can write supernatural horror. There's so much room in there to play and write these different stories. I write a couple of the last stories I wrote a folk horror story set in like puritanical times that has like a biblically accurate angel in it that was partly inspired by like Ted Chiang's work. His story, Hell is the Absence of God, was a story that kind of blew my mind. And so, I'm post Black Mirror, my work changed a lot too, right? There's so many different places where my voice changed. Coming out of my MFA program, my work changed a little bit. So short stories, they allow you to experiment, to have fun, to play, and you don't spend as much time on them. I might spend anywhere from a day to a week to a month on a short story, but I'm not too precious with my work. I'm kind of a feast or famine kind of writer. I've been lucky enough to get to know Stephen Graham Jones over the years, and we've become friends, and I consider him kind of an informal mentor. And every time we've got to hang out and talk about stuff, I just love talking shop because he's just so down to earth. We're both like that. I think we, somewhere around like the 40th or 50th story we wrote, we thought, I think I know how to write a short story now. And we're just also not that precious with it. So, I mean, I've written stories that I've started in the morning, had a deadline at midnight, wrote a rough draft, 5,000, 6,000 words, put it aside for an hour, came back, reread it, cleaned it up, turned it in, got accepted to the anthology, ended up being the anchor story in an anthology, and the anthology wins the Bram Stoker Award.
Nice.
So I mean, and then I have days I get absolutely nothing,
Yeah.
So, but I think part of it is, I don't know if you can tell, I have a little ADHD. I'm a little bit of a spaz. I a little bit, I can spiral and get a little excited about things. But I like to focus. And so like when I'm writing a short story, once I'm in that world, once I figure out where it is, when I understand what I'm doing, I want to stay with it. Once the camera's rolling, I can see it all happening. Like I just want to buckle up and write it till it's done. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I type pretty fast. I type like 70 words a minute. And so I can do a story in a day. It doesn't happen all the time, but I like that. The same thing with books. Like it used to take me a long time. I wrote the first half of my novel Disintegration in my MFA program. Went to my second semester. My first professor loved it. He didn't like it. He said he thought that it was not thesis material, which means not good enough. And wanted me to write literary short fiction with him. And I almost left the program because I was so freaked out and bummed out. And I realized it was an opportunity. And so I studied with him and I learned a lot. And I'm glad I did, because it was kind of a little bit of a gap in my knowledge. And I'm glad I did. Not just authors I wouldn't have read, literary authors I wouldn't have read. I discovered along the way, Joyce Carol Oates and Margaret Atwood and Toni Morrison and Haruki Murakami and Cormac McCarthy and Dennis Johnson and Mary Gateskill, all these dark sheep in the literary world. When he introduced me when I graduated, like he made me cry. I thought he hated me. And he said, if anybody's gonna be the next Stephen King coming out of this program, it's gonna be Richard Thomas. And I was like, wow. I was like, it turns out that he was harder on the people he thought had a chance to
potential.
Do yeah. And so he really kind of cracked the whip. But my work changed. It became more weird, more uncanny. And then kind of, I think during COVID, I couldn't be as bleak anymore, because so much was bleak around us that I kind of leaned a bit more into hope punk. So I started having more hopeful, maybe the ending, maybe the outcome, maybe it's justice served, maybe it's vengeance, maybe it's just surviving the horror. Sometimes the horror wins, but I couldn't just have bleak, down, bleak, stay down, everybody dies, everything loses. I can only write so many of those stories, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that by its very nature kind of leaned more into the uncanny, lean more into a sense of wonder, right? I want the light and the dark. If you look at the word awful, it just means full of awe, right? And so that awe can be a good or a bad thing. And so I think along the way, my last short story collection, Spontaneous Human Combustion, was a finalist for the Bram Stoker Award. And there was a lot of hope punk in there. And it made me feel really good to make that final ballot, because I wasn't sure how this stuff was working for the people out there and how people in the HWA felt about the horror I was writing. Was it horror enough? And so that made me feel really good. Out of 64 collections that were recommended that year, be in the final 6 is pretty cool. So you can write different stuff, you can experiment, you can dabble in different genres, you can try out different genres, and then you can connect with a huge group of people. You connect with editors, you connect with publications, the art staff, the not just the editors who acquire the work, but the editors who edit the work. I've met so many people, got to know so many editors, and met so many authors, and shared table of contents, and they help boost your signal and they get your name out there. And all of that is beneficial to you as you kind of build your platform, if you build your body of work, get your name out there, try and get discovered, try and get invited into things, try and, make a name for yourself. And so all of that is why I write short stories. Plus, I just love doing it. It's the kind of thing I can do between books. When I'm writing a book, I don't write short fiction at all, because I tend to write my books pretty fast. The last one, Incarnate, I wrote 52,000 words in 2 weeks, 4,000 words a day. It was just 4 1,000 word scenes. And then it was like 3 acts of those, 6 chapters. Each chapter had 4 scenes, each scene 1,000 words. And it just seemed to work really well for me. And once I got I've been doing research for 2 years. I've been, watching The Thing and watching the entire TV series of The Terror, and reading the book The Terror, and reading anything on Arctic and Sin Eaters and Alaska. And I watched documentaries and YouTube videos, and I had to fill my head with all the imagery so I could push everything I learned aside, everything I read, and forget it, and then just be in that space, right? Yeah. And that I think when I got it rolling, that's how it works for me. That it's feast or famine, and that works. But I tell my students, don't write a book until you really have a strong sense of who you are, because the biggest thing people don't understand is it's like 10 or 15 times longer than anything you've ever written as far as a short story, 5,000-6,000 words. And the pacing, the depth, the layers, how much you have to talk about, how much meat needs to be on the bone, how much story you have to tell, and not just wander for 70,000 words. Purposeful writing is hard. It's a marathon. Whereas short stories, Stephen King said short stories were like a stolen kiss in an alleyway. I think short stories are more like a one night stand or a fling.
Yeah.
Flash fiction maybe a stolen kiss in an alley, but it's a whole different beast. And I love writing books, but man, they take a lot out of you. They take a lot of work, and I just can't do them all the time. And so in between those, in order to be creative and to connect with other people and get my name out there and get recognition and make a little extra money and connect with all these wonderful people, like I write short fiction.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, great.
It's
an awesome answer. But I have to wonder, especially with writers, and I always ask this too, who have a lot of collections out, how is it that you go about choosing the stories for a collection?
It's interesting. Spontaneous human combustion. I'd been, as I mentioned, I've been kind of going through this kick where I was writing a bit more hope punk, and so a lot of the stories from just those 3 years just made sense together because they all were kind of coming from a very similar place, and so they felt like they belonged together. Now there are some stories in there. The one you were just talking about that was in Gutted Beautiful Horror Stories, Repent, is a realism story, and it has kind of a heartbreaking ending to it. There's hope in there, just not necessarily for our protagonist. And so depending on how you look at it, so there was a grouping of stories that seemed to fit together pretty well. I'm putting together my 5th one now, and it seems like I just kind of work in these clumps of perspective for a while. And so I'm looking at everything I've written in the last couple of years going into this story, and they seem to all fit well together. There are a couple I'm not putting in, stories that are just a little weirder or don't quite fit the theme, or there's like one I just have never really believed in. I just don't think it's good enough, so I'm just not going to put it in. But aside from that, my stuff's always kind of a weird combination. I mean, even Spontaneous Human Combustion, there's like the last story, the novelette in their Ring of Fire, is like it's a science fiction horror story, and but I think the heart of it is similar to the heart of the other stories, even if they're slightly different. So I like having a little bit of a variety. I see it like a 15-course meal. We're all going to work well together, but this amuse-bouche and this dessert and this soup course versus this meat course is they're different flavors, but they're all coming from the same chef, right? Yeah. And so I think a lot of what I'm doing now is again kind of in that uncanny space. Maybe pushing a little bit more into some places I haven't been before, like a couple folk horror stories, and then a little science fiction here and there. I think the Lightspeed story will fit. It might be the kind of the oddball in the collection, just that it's a little slightly different flavor. But I think the heart of it is what feels the same to me.
Yeah. Your answer there kind of reminds me of something Laird Barron said once, or at least compared putting together a short story collection is sort of like, at least I think it was Laird who said this, it's sort of like making a record, a music record, the songs, and you always have like a bunch of stuff that you can choose from, but you always gather the ones that make sense to go in that. And that always makes me think of B-sides. Like, do you think you could ever release like a B-sides where it's just like there's no theme or feeling? It's just like all the ones that didn't make it into a collection.
There definitely are some oddball ones out there that probably could be B-sides. Yeah, I like what you say about an album because it is kind of an orchestral movement. It is kind of a progression from one thing to the next. They have to have a relationship to each other. They're by the same band, but it doesn't mean they're gonna have the same flavor or the same emotion. It might be an upbeat one, then it might be a ballad, and it might be a hard driving one. And I'm one of my favorite bands are probably like Radiohead and like The Cure. And The Cure has kind of a strong flavor that usually is indicative in most of their work, but Radiohead has such range and such weirdness from album to album.
Very much so,
You never know what you're gonna get, right? So I think if I could compare myself to anyone, well, I'm probably more of The Cure than I am Radiohead, but I would like to think I had Radiohead in me.
Well, there's nothing wrong with saying you're like The Cure. Like that's pretty damn good too.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, I think I'm probably a bit more emo, probably a bit more dark and moody, than I am.
I don't know. Honestly, if I were to put your music, your work to music, I would go with more Radiohead. Honestly.
Yeah,
because it has that dark undertone. Radiohead. That, I mean, obviously The Cure can too, but they do have like their poppy songs. When Radiohead do their poppy songs, it's still dark as shit. It's like...
yeah. It's funny you say that. during COVID, one of the things my family did, my wife and my son and my daughter, we would listen to albums together. And that was a really cool experience because I can't remember the last time when I was a kid, you drive around and you either had a cassette tape or you had a CD, but you pop it in and you just played the whole thing, right? You know, if you had a cassette tape, you aren't stopping and picking songs. You're putting a cassette tape in and you're just letting it go. It hits the end and it flips over and then it keeps going. Like you just listen to the whole fucking album, right? And so I was so funny because my son's just starting to get into some bands I like, and I was looking at some old U2 and REM, and I was like thinking about the album what's the orange cover on the album? One of the albums I listened to in college, listened to it over and over and over again. And I'm like, I listen to that album front to back all the time. And so I think the experience of a collection, it should be this progression. It should be this relationship from the same chef, from the same band, the same painters, series of artworks. You know, there's a relationship to each other, but I think you can have a little fun with it. I mean, I think people who've been reading, if people have been reading my work for years, and this is not their first of my work, they've read a number of my collections, I think they have a pretty good idea of what they're going to get when they read one of my stories. And so I try to give them what they come to me for, what they come to expect, what, you know, I want to satisfy and make them happy, but I also want to kind of do something. I don't want to keep just regurgitating the same old story.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was really happy to write this puritanical horror story because I don't write a lot of historical fiction because I find it hard. I have to do the research, but I kept seeing the movie The Witch, and it really just drove that vision. And so that paired with the biblically accurate angel, it turned into a pretty cool story that was quite weird. I like that quite a bit. And then I had like some other folk horror I was doing too. So I think, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's still going to be me, you know, but I want to be able to surprise you a little bit too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Keep you on your toes.
Now, recently you released Incarnate.
Yeah.
That came out, was it early October?
September 11th, actually. I think.
Oh, wow. Okay. What a date.
Yeah. I don't know what we were thinking.
well, you know what? It doesn't matter because it's a great book. Can you please give us a synopsis? What's the what's this book about?
Yeah. When I think of the word incarnate, to me it means made flesh. And so part of what inspired this book, it was a couple different things. There's a short story I teach in one of my classes by Michaela Morissette called The Familiars. It was in the Jeff Vandermeer giant Bible called The Weird. It's like 800 pages, that one.
Yeah,
when I was looking for stories for The New Black, the first anthology I edited, that's one of the stories I took. And there's this entity under the bed of a young boy. And it's easy to say it's an imaginary friend, it's a creature under the bed, it's a ghost or a spirit. To me, it's something else. To me, it's a manifestation of grief and loss from his dead father. And so it's not just a ghost or a spirit, it's something else entirely. So that had been something I've been chewing on for a long time that I wanted to put into a book. Pair that with the idea of the sin eater. And I've been fascinated with the idea of a sin eater. And then the idea of like Barrow, Alaska, and like the 60, 80 days of darkness. I thought what would grow, what would flourish in the darkness, living in Chicago in the cold winters. And so it all came together in kind of this perfect storm of, I wanted to tell a story about a sin eater who lives in Barrow, Alaska. And he's there to kind of help the community. So the book is 3 acts, 3 different characters. And Sebastian's the first protagonist, and he's been doing this a long time, and this is his latest assignment. There's a tear in reality, and through the tear come these monsters. What we're not sure of is this a bad place that's drawing the creatures to it? Are the creatures, by coming here, are they making it bad? The other thing that happens when he absolves people of their sins, he goes to their deathbed or after they've recently died, and he eats a meal, something special, and then he absolves them of all their sin, so that when they die or when they can move, so they can move on, whether they move on to heaven or reincarnate or Valhalla, or whatever you believe, it's his job to make sure that they are forgiven and can pass on to wherever they need to go next. But then he has to do something with that sin he eats. So instead of ingesting it and keeping it, he bursts it into life. And so that's kind of the incarnate part of it, is these people's souls made into flesh. Now, if there's no tear in reality, because there are rules of when he can do this and when he can't do it, if the tear is closed and he bursts something into existence, there's nowhere for it to go. And so sometimes bad things happen, and people betray him or things or whatever goes on in the community, and he might birth a creature into existence that has nowhere to go but to stay there. And so that also helps to make the place this kind of dark stain, this 80 days of darkness and all the bad things that happen there. There's enough already going on there in Alaska as it is. Being alone for so long, they're locked in, it's frozen, no cars in and out, no boats in and out, no planes in and out. It's like the isolation, the cold, the drinking, the death, the violence. It's a really dark place to be. And so that seemed like a fun thing to write about. And so I wanted to write about the sin eating and the creatures. And so I knew it was going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4 meals. I like to cook. I'm a bit of a foodie. I love food. And so every meal in the book is something I cook. The first meal he has is my chili recipe,
nice,
down to every ingredient I have in there. And so it's this balance of beauty and horror, right? Coming back to magic, lightness, and the darkness of wanting you to eat the meal and to salivate and enjoy it. And then things turn sour. Things go bad. The rules are he has to also eat whatever they put in front of him. He has to finish the whole thing, no matter how bad it is. And so, that is his own experience of what he has to go through. And so his whole first act is all about, creating these creatures. He's trying to send them through this tear to battle these other creatures. But by the nature of what he's doing, he can't take a knife to a gunfight. He can't, take a puppy dog to battle this like kaiju dinosaur like creature that's coming through because he's going to lose. And so he has to work with the worst people in the community because they're the ones that have these nasty tainted souls. And these are the ones that give birth to the worst monsters, right? So it's this really tough relationship he has. The second act is a switch over to a desert wasteland with this creature, this mother monster, and how she's trying to save her children and save the land. And there's a connection with that comes back to the first act. I don't want to say any more about that. And then the third act comes back to the young boy Calic, who had been studying with our protagonist in the first act. And so now he takes over as the Sin Eater. But much like kind of my generation or even my parents' generation to my children's generation now, Calic, he feels like the absolution is bullshit, right? He's like, he's like, so basically you're a bad person on your deathbed. You ask God for forgiveness, and you get forgiven, and you can come back and do it all over again. He's like, no, I'm not gonna do that. He's like, if you're bad, there's gonna be consequences. So he changes it the way he practices his magic to amplify whatever you are. And if you're good with flaws, you're gonna get into heaven anyway. You were always gonna get in. God's not asking for perfection, right? But if you're bad, then there's going to be consequences. And so he changes things. And so that's his own journey of what he does and how he feels about his community and the ride that he goes on. It was a lot of fun to write. It was a hard book. I think probably the hardest books I've had to write. So much research, so much I had to learn before I could really feel the confidence to write it. But then I also wrote, like I said, 52,000 words in 2 weeks. And the remaining, it was a total of 78. The rest I wrote every Friday for the next 6 weeks and got it done. So it just kind of came spilling out of me for the most part.
Does it feel like maybe all the work you did for the 2 years before you started writing it just built up until when you started writing it just kind of exploded out of you?
Yeah. It's a weird thing because I don't know how much you've written stories and books and whatnot, but it's a process, and I never feel confident writing anything, whether it's flash fiction or 5,000 or a novelette or a novella or a novel, if I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. And I have to know it so well that I can write to it without having to constantly stop and do research. I did. I even hired a guy, Repo Kemp, who we wrote a short story together that actually made Ellen Datlow's long list for best horror of the year. He's a great writer in and of himself, but he spent time in Alaska and the Arctic. And so I hired him to help me get it right. Like Stephen King hires a firearms expert. I hired Repo to let me know what I was screwing up, and then to give me, what else have I missing? There was a great example. He talked about this ritual of when new people came to the Arctic or Alaska, depending where you are, they would be gifted with a block of this pure glacier ice. And so you come out on your front porch and then be a big block of ice with an ice pick in it. And it was actually, when you chip it off and let it melt, it's this really pure, amazing water, glacial water. But if you didn't know better, you'd be like, what's this threat of ice in a pickle?
It's just a threat. Yeah.
So it was a lot of research. And I think it's one of those things that you want. I prefer not to do research. I really like to write from a place of one emotion, or I like to write from things I feel. I like to have feeling drive my work, but it's hours of research to get a page of material, a page of notes to give you a sentence of detail. So I don't know what all I absorbed over, and visual mediums work better for me, like watching The Terror for like 3 years or however long it was. There was so much imagery and so much winter and ice and wind. It just really helped fill my head so that when I sat down to write the story, I knew exactly where I was at it. And it was just a matter, and I knew the characters. And then depending on the act, like the first act, there were 24 chapters. I knew that one the most. And so out of those 24, there were maybe 16 scenes that I knew. The others I had to find along the way. And there was a lot of really fun, happy accidents. I like to find things kind of organically as I go. And so when I run into something, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Besides the three characters, the fourth character in the book is really the place, the land, the Arctic wasteland, this really cold, dangerous place, this nature that doesn't care about you. If you go outside and you're stupid, you're just going to die. There's no one's looking out for you. You're just going to freeze to death, right? And so that's whenever I got stuck, I would just lean into, what I like to do, what I think I do best. I'm a maximalist writer, so I would lean into setting and sensory detail, and I would lean into the setting. So the place and the danger and nature. There's a scene early on in the book where Sebastian is walking from his house down to the diner, and he's talking to a local guy about, this pool and when they're going to close the bridge. And this woman's unloading her trunk, and her toddler is just kind of behind her in a little pink snowsuit, just kind of, bobbling along. And out of the woods come tumbling these two feral dogs. Yeah. And they're attacking each other, and they're rolling around. And it happens so fast. And then next thing you know, they tumble into the girl, and it's just this ball of fur and pink and fluff and everything. And they're like, holy shit. And so he's like, Sebastian's talking to this guy. The guy runs and gets his gun. He comes over. He's like, take the shot. It's like he shoots one dog, shoots the other dog, kills him. Sebastian runs over. The mother comes running over. My baby, and like he gets to her. He pulls the fluff and the coat, and like there's a smear of blood across her head. And he checks her out, and she's totally fine. Yeah. It's just blood from the dog, or like a scratch on her head, like all the padding and all the stuff. Like they could never really get to her, and she was just totally fine. But in that moment, you think, "Oh shit, she's dead!" Right? They're just tearing her to pieces. And so I purposely, this is me leaning away from the bleak and towards the magic and wonder. I didn't want to kill this girl, this little baby girl, toddler, both these rabid dog. But I wanted to remind people of how dangerous it is. And if you're not paying attention, you unload the truck of your car and you let your daughter wander away. Bad things happen, so you got to pay attention. And so that was a scene I hadn't planned on writing, but it felt organic to the moment and seemed to work for me. So
I just wanted to mention that Incarnate is one of the most unique books I have ever read.
Oh, thank you.
The three parts are all very different from each other. Well, the first and the third have obviously they're similar for a reason. Yeah, but they're still very different. Yeah. But what really kind of threw me at first was the second act. Yeah. And I want to mention also that there's a lot of heartbreak in this book, like especially in that second act. There's like so much heartbreak. Yeah. But there's also a lot of hope too. Like there is a balance. Yeah. And I was really impressed with that. Like how do you that's got to be hard to write.
Yeah. When you understand what's really going on in the second act, which I'm sure you do, you understand its connection back to the first act. There's a lot of sympathy for the mother monster and what she's going through. She comes into that story talking about the loss of her family and her children and all these things. And it's just like she's alone, and she's become kind of bitter and angry and doesn't give a crap about anybody. But then she realizes that
she gets very cold and hard.
Yeah. But as is the way of the Arctic, as is the way of the desert, you have to survive. You have to be kind of, cold-hearted at times. But what she discovers along the way is that she cares about this land, and she cares about the animals. She realizes she's a part of something bigger than her, right? And so she works hard to try and save that place. And over time, as you're reading, you start to understand her connection with the other side and the connection with the first act and what's going on, what's passing back and forth, how that works. And so she goes on this journey. And if you're paying attention in the second act, you'll also pick up on what her journey is really about and where she really comes from, right? And then when we flip back over to Calic, like he's taking over based upon what happens in the first act, and he feels that things should be different. And so that it's a really interesting journey because I think the first act is kind of everything I thought of would be in a Sin Eater story. Like, it was kind of the conventional point of view and the conventional way I thought this book would play out. Switching over to her act was a departure, but I just felt like I couldn't do the whole thing in the Arctic. I felt like it was too much, too cold, too much repetition and redundancy. And when I realized who she was, it really pushed me to. I wanted to write a desert horror story. I wanted to write a dying land story. Mm-hmm. And so it gave me a chance to have a different flavor on this trip, right? As opposed to all the cold. And then when it comes back to Calic, he's a different person. So he sees the community differently than Sebastian does. And he has different goals, and yet there's still a lot of threats to the people that live there. And he decides to do his own thing. I think some of the more chilling moments of the book come in some of his passages. I will say, though, and first, I appreciate the compliments. It really means a lot to me, because I was very worried that this structure and the format was going to be a problem for people. And my agent even said she wasn't entirely sure about it. And I said, well, let me finish it. Let's see how it goes. I like it where it is. I know it's a little weird. I don't know how the movie would work. Maybe the middle section will just be, it'll be an A24 film. It'll be like,
yeah, for sure.
Weird Arctic in the first half. The second act will be all animated. And then the third act will come back. I don't know. I think I have an idea of what they could do, but I don't want to say it out loud because I might spoil some things. But I think getting to the third act with Calic, like some of the things that he sees, the way he's connected to his people, and the way he changes and decides, I'm not going to, you could say it's a progressive push left in this country or left in the world towards, just more community, more support for people in general, towards socialism or whatever you want to call it, of support and community. And that he says, if you do bad things, you're going to be punished. And if you need help, we're going to help, but we need, we're doing this together, but you're not going to be forgiven. It's like, it's the difference between, silencing somebody and just a consequence of your actions. And, I think we're starting to see some things happen in this country. And I didn't write it as a political manifesto of any, but there are some issues at the heart of it that do mean something to me. And I, at my heart, I care about people. And I it's really frustrating when we realize we have enough food to feed everybody. We have enough for everybody, that this country isn't doing the things a lot of developed nations are already doing. I just feel like we're just falling short of where we could be. So this is a horror story, and it's a weird horror story, but there's some underlying meaning in there. I also try to write my books, Jason, kind of on different levels. I try to write it body, mind, and soul, in that if you just want to be entertained, if you don't want to think about stuff, if you don't want to look at politics, you want to look at symbolism, you don't have to. You can just read the book, be entertained, watch the chess pieces move around, and be entertained. That's my first goal, is can I grab your attention, get you turning the pages, and then be an exciting read. If you want more, I then try and write at another level where there's emotion, where if you're open to it emotionally, I will try and move you. I will try and scare you, turn you on, freak you out, like whatever's happening. I want to have an emotional connection with you if you're open to it. And then intellectually is I want to try and do something that will kind of blow your mind, stimulate your brain pan, so that when you're done reading the book, you're still thinking about parts of the book later. And so,
yeah,
that's what I'm trying to do. You talked about writing and how, what it takes out of us. I think when I do my best work, I feel spent when I'm done. Yeah. When I wrote the second half of my book, Disintegration, 40,000 words in a week, I cried. I thought I was going to throw up. I was empty. I'd been that guy. I'd been through hell with him, and it took a lot out of me. Same thing with Incarnate. Writing the bulk of that in 2 weeks took a lot out of me. When I write a really intense short story in a day, it's method writing. I'm in there. It's the character. It's myself. It's the camera. We're all together watching this thing. It's unfolding, and I'm in that moment. I'm living it, right? And when you go through these really traumatic, intense, wondrous experiences, man, it takes a lot out of you. So I feel like when I'm writing, if I don't feel spent at the end of what I've done, if I don't feel like vulnerable, if I don't feel a little sick, a little exposed, a little uneasy about what I've done, then I feel like I probably haven't pushed myself hard enough.
Awesome. Like, this book will stick with me for a long time.
Thanks.
I think it might make my my top 10 list at the end of the year. Isn't necessarily a big deal, but I think it's gonna make it. Spoiler alert, it's gonna make it, because this book
Thanks, man.
This book haunts me for various different reasons.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? I would love to hear what your experience has been like. I mean, in what ways?
In reading the book? Well,
yeah.
Well, while reading it, the language and the things that happen in the book, just my brain was able to just latch on and hold on for the ride. Yeah. So when the emotions came, I felt those emotions, but there are certain scenes in this book
Mm-hmm.
that are really hard to read, especially in the third act.
Yeah.
And I think you probably, I don't want to say it in case I spoil something, but there's a certain situation with a dog that was really hard to read through. And I was like, oh my God, I remember where I was reading that, and I think I'll always remember. It's just that scene, but the ending too, just with I'll just say the mob boss.
Yeah.
That was fascinating and
Yeah.
interesting.
Thanks. Yeah.
The whole ride itself, it's such a roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
You're up and then you're down. You're up and then you're down. Then for a little while, you're down a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of dread and sadness, and then you go back up and then you go back down.
Yeah.
It's just a ride, man. It's like I every time I sat down to write, I didn't know what drug I was going to be taking.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I try to. I talk to my students about it. You know, when we move on to books, I say let's do that 120 crayon box, right? Let's use all the colors, the burnt sienna, all the weird colors. I want it to be a tapestry, right? I want it to be the full experience. And when you write, I didn't want it to all just be the one note, the one dark note, the one piece of dark chocolate, just the banging the gong, just the heavy metal on the ending. Like I want that in moments, but I want it to be balanced by balanced by bird song, balanced by magic and light, because whatever you do, if you do it too much in a row, it just deadens your sentence to that experience. And so there is a lot of dread, there is a lot of darkness, there is a lot of bleakness, but there's a lot of hope in there too.
There's a lot of hope too.
And
like
I tried with every story to find a way to at least speak to what they've been through, if not resolve. And some people are going to win, some people are going to lose, but I think there's also a lot of awareness of their place in everything. And I purposely did try to put some hope at the end because I had to, right?
Yeah.
these days, especially, right?
But that's part of the thing. I'm used to reading dreadful stuff because I read a lot of horror, and some people never leave that dread. They stick there, which is fine, honestly. But I love it when you have those sprinkles of hope or good things.
Thanks.
That really change the way you feel while you're reading it.
Yeah, I wouldn't compare this to the books I'm going to mention, but when I think about epic sagas, when I think about Perdita, when I think about The Stand, when I think about when I think about like Clive Barker's Weave World, I think about McCammon's Swan Song, like these are journeys, these are epic sagas that it puts you through the ringer. And like, while this is only 78,000 words, like I want the full experience for you, right? And so I want you to come away from it, as broken and moved and hopeful as I was writing it, right?
Yeah.
I can remember reading the end of it. My daughter, she used to walk around the block with me when I was writing the book, and I'd talk to her throughout the whole process. She and I talk about my writing a lot. She's read a lot of my work. Now that she's older, she can read it, some of the stuff. But she read my last collection. She likes my work. And I wanted her to read the end. And I was worried it was going to be too preachy, too sappy. I don't want to be pushing anything down anybody's throat. And I read her the last couple of scenes, and I look over, and her eyes are tearing up, and I was like, oh, is it good? She's like, yeah. I was like, okay. I was like, okay, because I'm reaching for that. Chuck Palahniuk says, teach me something, make me laugh, and break my heart. Right?
Yeah.
And if you're not a humorist, I think there is some humor in this book, but it's dark humor and not a lot of humor. But I also flip it to teach me something, scare me, freak me out, and break my heart. And so I think it's the heartbreaking stuff I think that I like to work towards, because that's just compassion. That's just feeling. That's emotion. Yeah. And so, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is apathy. And so whatever I want you to experience some strong emotions. My wife won't even read she won't read my literary stuff from my MFA because she said she can feel herself being manipulated by me. And I made her cry with the stuff I've written. And I'm like, well, that's one of my literary stories. And I'm like, well, you definitely don't want to read. Although I will say that she has been reading Incarnate. She came to a reading I did, and I was like, "Are you sure? People are going to be reading horror. Are you okay with this?" And she's like, "Yeah, no, I want to come support you." And I was like, "Okay." And I read the opening to the book, and she's like, "That's like really good." I think she hasn't read my stuff in like 10 years. She's "You've gotten a lot better." She's like, "I would like to read your book." And I was like, "What?" And we were getting on the plane. We're coming back from Stoker Con, and she started reading the book, and I was just like, I've arrived.
Nice.
So I get it. And I know it's not for everybody, but when I look at the comps on this book too, obviously The Thing and The Terror, but John Langdon's The Fisherman, Stephen Graham Jones, The Only Good Indians, but also Lois Lowry's The Giver. And so there's like a rural kind of native kind of folk horror kind of there's a hopeful part to the story that I wanted to weave into it. That was important to me. And so I think and then The Giver, if I remember correctly, was kind of a set of 3 or 4 novellas. Each book was really short. There were a couple, and they continued the story, which is kind of how I did mine. And so I think some of that literary stuff, got folded in as well, because I wanted it to be there, and I didn't want it to be just even going through the first act where you're starting to see the repetition of some of the things of the meals and the creatures. Even then I had to look for variety, and obviously building up to the climax at the end of the first act. But
yeah,
I don't like repeating things, but I understand repetition for effect, and I love a progression of things. I like the rule of 3s, and then I have a thing called the Brian Evanson rule of 4, where he often will do the rule of 3s, and the 4th thing he does is like really weird and abstract, and so I try to follow that as well.
Yeah.
And so I want it to be all those things, which is a lot to ask of a book, I know, but
yeah. One final question about this,
yeah.
and actually this could go to all your work.
Sure.
Is the prose. Now, I've read dense prose where my brain just it kind of repels it. It's like, I don't like this, right? And it's a struggle. Your prose can be kind of dense too, but it's dense in such a way that, like I mentioned earlier, my brain just grabs onto it and suddenly I'm there. I'm not saying that your writing's like Margaret Atwood, but it kind of, because Margaret Atwood has a similar sort of, her prose can be kind of dense, but my brain will latch onto it in a similar way. So I can't write like that at all. Like, I've tried and it just doesn't work. But so I'm wondering how do you do that? Like, how, when you get into the language, the meat, then the potatoes of it. Yeah,
it's tough. I think it's a lifetime of learning. It's a lifetime of reading. The people that I ape, the people I look to, when I read Cormac McCarthy when I was in my MFA program. And so like Blood Meridian is a book that had a profound effect on me. And that's a very dense book. I had to read that in small bites. I would say the same thing for other maximalists, people like China Mieville's Perdido Street Station was a big influence on me. That book is such a perfect mix of fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And then more recently, Jeff Vandermeer's work, especially Annihilation, there is stuff in there I'd never seen before. Echo horror, environmental horror, the stuff he does with things that are not blood and guts violence, but are ash and moss and fungus and greenery, and the things he does, I just really, the Crawler, I think about Perdido with the Weaver and all these different, this really, for me, it's all those people. I've always loved, like, dense music. You can look at people like I mentioned, Radiohead and The Cure, like poetry. I've always appreciated music. I used to play saxophone for a number of years. I'm a classically trained tenor. I sang in choir in high school and college. Awesome. I went to Bradley University, performed with the Peoria Civic Opera and the orchestra. And so I've my whole life, I've sought out these moments of these larger than life, experiences. Right. And so I think when I write, it's me trying to tell the story, but in a way that goes as deep as I can without it being padding and without it being purple. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's exactly part of it is it's been a long time kind of figuring out my voice, and I think I'm different. If you read some of my earlier work, it's probably a little more stripped down. This book was definitely me leaning into all the setting and sensory, because like I said, the backdrop, the place in nature is like the 4th biggest character in here, and it's in here a lot. It's the tapestry upon which I hang all of their stories. So I wanted it to be immersive. I wanted all these, I tell my students when it comes to setting and sensory detail, it's all 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, all of them. And so I've gotten used to looking for those opportunities to use all 5 senses whenever I can. And then I try, on my rough drafts, I just try and get it down. But on my edits, I try and improve. And so on the first draft, maybe I say red, and maybe on the next draft, it's it's a different shade of red, or it's a color that's really an emotion, or it's something else. I try to create things that don't exist. I like juxtapositions. I like putting things together that are a weird combination, because I think, like in poetry or other dense maximalists, you're creating something that nobody else has created by noun your verbs and verbing your nouns and just kind of shoving things together in weird ways. Because I'm trying to create something original, something new and fresh and different, at the same time trying to be accessible and be familiar in a way that you can read my work, without it being too much. I've had people call my work purple. I've had people say it's too much, and I'm sure I am not for everybody. but I try to make sure that, I think it's Vonnegut. It says every sentence must advance the plot or reveal character. And I think Le Guin or somebody said, or build the world, setting. So I'm constantly going between those three things. And so I'm always looking at the place I'm in and the people I'm with and what's going on in the moment. And then I try and play up what's happening in that moment. So like you'll notice there isn't a lot of food in the book until we get to that first bowl of chili, and then it's like hyper focused on the food. When we get to like Calic later, or the first time we go into the diner, it's like suddenly everything's cold and like blue and white and just like empty and sterile out. And then you come into a space like it's warm and it's colorful and it's all these smells and garlic and onions. Like I just try to be open to what I see in the world when I write it, and if I'm channeling it well, then I'm kind of a method writer. I'm in the moment, so I just try to record and recount what I see, and then the last edit I do when I edit something is like down to like the ed versus ing. How does it read? I either read dialogue out loud or I have a very loud internal voice. They've noticed tonight I'm very talkative. That I can hear dialogue very loud. I don't have to read it out, but I will see what words I trip over, and I'll change an ed to an ing if it flows better, or if I see a repetition of words, I'll change. Every book I'll have one word. I mean, obviously this one it was like ice and snow, and I had to change. Poor Repo helping me like get this book right, but I had a book where they used the word sheen like 27 times for no reason. Maybe it was a hot book. I look for opportunity to be weird. I look for opportunity to be human. I want to be human. I want to be emotional. And I try to just tap into whatever's happening in that place and time so that, I haven't been to the Arctic. I also haven't been to Mars. I also haven't killed anybody. So I just try and absorb everything I've ever seen. That's why I constantly go and like see all these A24 films and Neon and Blumhouse. And that's why I'm constantly reading all these anthologies, is I'm trying to pick up what I can from all the people around me, surround myself with geniuses, and just kind of absorb through osmosis what they're doing and see if I can't get a small amount of that back on the page.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. That's something what I've been trying to do too. Surround myself with people who are smarter than me. This is way I like to say it.
Yeah.
But
I say if I walk into a room and I think I'm the smartest guy in the room, I need to find another room.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I don't learn that way, and I definitely love teaching, and I love helping people, and I hold open doors and windows because people did that for me for many, many years and still are. And so I try to, pay that forward. But, I have to keep reading. There was a time I couldn't read Cormac McCarthy. I'm still trying to get through House of Leaves. There's a lot of Ted Chiang's work I just don't get, but I try. And then, when stuff works for me, it works. And, those are the moments where we have epiphanies. That's when we have, changes, and that's where we have an evolution of whatever we're trying to do. Right.
Yeah. All right. So we have a question from the audience, just one.
Sure.
And I'm not too sure I can answer this one myself. We'll see if you can. Okay. I usually ask a question at the end of each interview to each guest, asking what authors you think people should be talking about more. So I'm going to kind of combine that with this one. And the question is, greetings, gentlemen. Looking for some scary reads. Just started to read more again. What top 5 horror books would you suggest to pick up? Thanks. And that's by Steve Mares. Thank you, Steve, for asking that question. This is tough for me because I get creeped out sometimes, but I don't typically get scared when I read horror. I can get scared when I'm watching a horror movie, but not so much when I'm reading. It's not easy question to answer, but I guess I would put I think honestly, like Stephen King's Pet Sematary was the last half of that book is pretty scary. It's scary for many different reasons though. So I don't know if that would if that's something you would be looking for, Steve.
Yeah. So the books I teach in my dark fiction class, I teach them because I love them. So I'll give you 5 books. And then we'll see which one works for you. But if you haven't read Josh Malerman's Bird Box, it's a great book. When I read it the day after Thanksgiving. I read it in one setting at my mom's house by the fireplace, sweating for like 3 hours. So
that book, you know what? You're right. That book is pretty spooky too.
Yeah, it goes back and forth with the 2 timelines. I love that. To me, Josh's work it was like a rebirth of Stephen King. So I read that book like I had read, The Shining back in the day, right? So that's one. if you like stuff that's a little weird, Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation is a wonderful book. It's really strange. It's really unsettling. It's quite creepy. Also quite moving. I love that book a lot. I would put Annihilation in my top 10 books of all time. Maybe
I love that book. What did you think of the movie adaptation?
I wasn't happy with it, and I should have listened to Jeff because I saw him post on Facebook, and he's like, "It's amalgamate. It's kind of everything put together. It's kind of go into it thinking inspired by the trilogy."
Yeah,
and that's
absolutely.
I wanted the book, and I'm like, just do the goddamn first book, and it would have been great.
Yeah.
They didn't, and so I was disappointed because it wasn't what I wanted. But there were some cool moments. The bear, the flowers, the
bear is spooky. Yeah,
there's some good stuff in there.
Yeah.
I'm refinishing the trilogy. I teach Annihilation in my class a couple times a year. But I just recently reread Authority, and now I'm working through the third one because I want to work up towards Absolution, the new one.
Yeah.
And the second and third I don't like as much. They're very different, but I'm enjoying them. So I would say Jeff's work. Sarah Graham's Come Closer. I put Bird Box and Come Closer as straightforward, fairly simple, straightforward reads. But something about Come Closer, the possession book, gets under my skin and freaks me out. It's going to work or it's not, and it may not work for you at all. But if it does, I think that's a really good, fun read. I used to teach Stephen Graham Jones All the Beautiful Sinners in that slot, but going from Annihilation to All the Beautiful Sinners to Perdido was too much for people. And so I put Sarah's book as a shorter and more straightforward. But I will say All the Beautiful Sinners is my favorite Stephen Graham Jones book. It's a more serious book. It's kind of Silence of the Lambs meets No Country for Old Men with a Native American slant to it. It's brilliant. I think they're reissuing it, but I have the old book, hardcover or paperback, get it. And then Perdido Street Station is a book I love. It's an epic one. I would put that out there. Fantasy, sci-fi, horror. It's complex, but he's just so original. I love Clive Barker's Weave World. I would say American Psycho. Something about that. That's the only book that ever made me gag. But it's a weird voice. A lot of pop culture and stuff. So I don't know either. Again, it's like House of Leaves. Either works for people or it doesn't. Those are some of the ones that pop out to me. And if I could give you a couple short stories. Because out of my workshop, I every year I pick anything I give like a 9 rating or higher, I put on a special list. So I'm going to throw some names of authors and stories at you guys. Hunt them down. So Steve Rasnick, Tem, Between the Pilings, Alyssa Wong's Hungry Daughters of Starving Mothers, Stephen Graham Jones, Daniel's Theory on Dolls, one of my favorite stories of his.
Nice.
Brian Hodge, I love his stuff. Check out It's All the Same Road in the End. Livia Llewellyn's Bright Crown of Joy. A.C. Wise's Harvest Song, Gathering Song is one of my favorites. A bunch of these are free online. They might be up at like Nightmare or The Dark or somewhere. Kelly Robson's A Human Stain. I love that one. That's at Tor. Usman Malik's work. He has a story called Dead Lovers on Each Blade Hung. Both parts are up. I think it's Nightmare or The Dark. I'm trying to focus on horror. Rich Larson has a story called Painless. It's a Tor that I love. Mm-hmm. Victor Laval's Up From Slavery was amazing. What else? Catriona Ward's A Hotel in Germany I like a lot. Sarah Pinsker's Two Truths and a Lie. Oh, another Steve Toast, Dancing Sober in the Dust. Love that one. I mentioned Laird Barron's Tiptoe. Kelly Link's Skinder's Veil was really great. All of these were either in Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy or Best Horror of the Year or Best American or Tor. What else? Daniela Tomova has one at Tor called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Reporter. That's really great. Rich Larson has another one. It's a funny one, but it's really great called Quandary Aminu versus the Butterfly Man. Gemma Files has a story B Sharp Minor or the Suicide Choir. Luigi Mussolino has one, The Last Box. It's great. Yeah, those are all stories I think that would really. So those authors in general, check them out, and then those stories.
Absolutely.
And if anybody out there is, in the sound of my voice wants this list, I will give it to you. I also have like a recommended reading list of like books and stuff, but I'm happy.
Would you be willing to email me that list?
Yeah,
especially of the short stories, because like the books I'm familiar with, I really love Perdido Street Station. Yeah. That book is it's out there. It's out there. So good though, right?
Yeah.
Like.
And then the ending, you just like want to throw the book across the room. It's so funny because I'd read that book 15 years ago at an advertising agency. I walked to a bus to a Blue Line L to a Metro train station out to Elgin. It was like 2 hours each way. And I worked with this like boutique of an agency out there. And every day I'd go down to this little Thai restaurant and get my little lunch for $10 and I'd read a chapter of the book. and that was an epic book. I just loved it, but I forgot the ending. So when I taught it for the first time, I was like, oh God, I was just like,
why?
just like, because it's so intense. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Steve says greatly appreciate the
Oh,
recommendations. He
Yeah.
hasn't read any of those, but he he mostly reads King and Kuntz.
Yeah.
So
I read a lot of
yeah,
early
definitely.
Kuntz, and then I kind of got off Kuntz for a while, but
Yeah, me too. Actually Kuntz kind of got me him and McCammon, Robert R. McCammon got me started in reading.
Yeah.
And John Saul, that's what I was reading when I was like 14.
Nice.
And then I moved on to King, and then in my 20s I got like to Lovecraft and all the more weirder stuff. And
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Awesome.
All right, well, before we go, what are you working on right now, just out of curiosity? And what do you have coming out soon that you can talk about?
Yeah. So obviously Incarnate came out in September, so that's been taking up a lot of my attention. I am trying to think what I have coming out. I have a couple stories come out this year. What's next year? Oh, because I had Lightspeed, and then I was in the off-season anthology, a short story called Sunk. And then next year there's an anthology called The Earth Bleeds at Night. I have a story in there called Supplication. And then there's this cool anthology called In One Day We Will Die, Strange Stories Inspired by the Music of Neutral Milk Hotel. And so I have a story in there called Naomi Ascends, and that's the puritanical witch, biblically accurate angel story. Okay. Other than that, I'm going to be writing a new one for Three Low Burning Eye. I don't know what I'm going to do yet. I have to figure that one out. Trying to figure out something I haven't done before. I was thinking about maybe doing a baton handoff story where you kind of go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and you never go back. I haven't done that in a long time. Mm-hmm. Someone had a story like that, and I thought that was cool. I was also thinking, I was teaching a story in class that was like, it was just an unlikable character from start to finish. Was it Sarah Lanigan? It was just really I have to tell you what story it is now, because it was such an intense story and people were so divided on it in class, but it was just really intense. Let me make sure I get the name right. Telltale Tit by Margot Lanigan. And it's this whole story, it's about stealing, about tongues, and it's a brutal story. But what it made me think of was, have I written like a really unlikable character that was just unlikable and mean and evil from start all the way to finish? Because usually I have a bad guy who turns good, or a good guy who goes bad. Like, I like the strong reversal, but have I written one recently that was just start to finish, just a real piece of crap? And then how do I write that in a way that people don't want to eject from the story, right?
Yeah. I think, honestly, my opinion on that is you got to make it interesting. Yeah, if it's interesting, at least that's my point of view. Because I've read plenty of unlikable characters, and if it's interesting, I'll keep going. But if I really can't stand them and it's just repulsive, then I'll sometimes kick out. Yeah. All right. So you were a phenomenal guest. I had so much fun picking your brain over everything, man. So, where can people find you online? You mentioned earlier where you all are, but
Sure.
If you could mention it all again.
Yeah, so I'm basically Richard G. Thomas 3 everywhere. So I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Blue Sky and Threads. And then my website for my classes is storyvilleonline.com. And so that's got all my classes and everything up there if you're interested in any of that stuff. That should be on. Oh, and I have a website, sorry. Called whatdoesnotkillme.com. I'm a big Kelly Clarkson fan. No, I'm kidding. It's a Nietzsche quote, but what does not kill me makes me stronger. I studied philosophy in college. Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. For when we stare into the abyss stirs back into us, right?
It would be funny if you're like, I want all my stories to be like Kelly Clarkson songs.
Yeah, really, I am. I'm just one at a time. Not that I'm anti-Kelly Clarkson. I like.
No. There's nothing wrong with that. But it would just be funny after everything we talked about.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. The invitation for you to come back anytime is out. Just let me know, and I'd love to talk to you again. Yeah, and I want to thank to everyone who came out during the live stream here to watch and listen, and to ask. Thanks to Steve for asking a question, and also thanks to the future people who will be coming along and listening. And thanks to you, Richard, for coming and giving me an awesome conversation. And we will see you all again shortly.
Cool. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Okay.